The alarm on Emma Martinez's bedside clock read 6:47 a.m. when she opened her eyes. For 3 seconds, she existed in that blissful pocket of time before consciousness fully arrived. 3 seconds where she didn't remember that her world had been systematically dismantled. Then reality crashed in like a cold wave, and her stomach began to twist. Today was the day, the custody hearing. The day a stranger in a black robe would decide which parent got to keep her, as if she were a possession to be divided rather than a person with a heartbeat and fears and dreams. Emma lay motionless under her grandmother's quilt, staring at the ceiling of the guest bedroom that had become her temporary sanctuary. The walls were painted a soft lavender, decorated with motivational posters about friendship and dreaming big, all relics from her grandmother's failed attempts to make this room feel less temporary, less like the physical manifestation of her family's collapse. She could hear the house beginning to wake up, water running in the bathroom, footsteps in the hallway. The distant sound of her grandmother's voice on the phone, probably calling the babysitter to confirm she wouldn't be needed today. Everything about this day felt different from other days. It had a weight to it, a significance that pressed down on Emma's small chest like a physical force. She'd been summoned to a courthouse, an actual courthouse, where lawyers would argue about her like she was a case number rather than a real person with real feelings. 8 years old, and the most important decision about her future would be made by someone who didn't know her at all. Someone who'd probably heard 100 custody cases and wouldn't remember hers 5 minutes after the gavel came down. Emma pulled the quilt up to her chin and turned to look at the nightstand beside her bed. There, in a small silver frame, was the photograph she'd taken herself last month. Max, her golden retriever, sitting in the backyard with his head tilted slightly, as if questioning the entire universe with his kind brown eyes. She'd snapped it on her phone, and her grandmother had it printed and framed by the next morning. Max wasn't here in this bedroom with her, but he felt closer when she had his photograph near. She picked up the frame and held it against her chest, as if the laminated image could somehow transmit comfort directly into her heart. The thing about Max was that he understood things without being told. He understood that Emma's life had fractured into a before and an after. Before, when her parents still loved each other, or at least pretended to convincingly enough. After, when every conversation was strained, every dinner eaten in silence, every moment threading with tension so thick it seemed to fill every room like smoke. Max had been there through all of it. He was there when her father's voice rose during arguments, positioning himself between Emma and the shouting, his body a physical barrier against the chaos. He was there when her mother went through entire weekends without leaving her bedroom, when Emma had to make her own lunches and fix her own hair because there was nobody else to do it. Emma had never been the kind of kid who talked about her feelings. Her mother had always said Emma was sensitive, and that she needed to toughen up to survive in the world. Her father, during better times, had called her his little observer, noticing how she watched rather than participated, how she seemed to be constantly analyzing the emotional temperature of any room she entered. Neither parent realized they were describing the survival skills of a child who'd learned early that speaking up meant causing problems. Keeping quiet meant maintaining fragile peace. So Emma had learned to swallow her words, to push her feelings down deep where they couldn't disturb anyone, to construct a careful smile that suggested everything was fine when everything was decidedly not fine. But Max didn't care about her smile. He could see through it the way he could see through closed doors. When Emma was hurting, Max knew. When she was scared, Max knew. And through a series of small gestures and signals they developed together, a particular way of moving her hand, a specific pattern of scratching behind his ears, they'd created their own language. A language that required no words, no explanation, no performance, just truth, just presence. Just the understanding that came from one broken soul, recognizing the brokenness in another. Her grandmother knocked softly on the door at 7:15 a.m., carrying a cup of hot chocolate with miniature marshmallows. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said gently, setting the mug on the nightstand beside Max's photograph. "I know today is a big day. Are you feeling okay?" Emma nodded because that's what you were supposed to do, even though her stomach felt like she'd swallowed a handful of rocks. Her grandmother sat on the edge of the bed, her weathered hand finding Emma's beneath the quilt. She didn't say anything else, which Emma appreciated. Sometimes words just got in the way. They drove to the courthouse in her grandmother's old sedan, the one that smelled like vanilla air freshener and old leather. Emma watched the city pass by the window, familiar streets and unfamiliar significance. They drove past the coffee shop where her father used to take her on Saturday mornings before everything got bad. Past the park where her mother had pushed her on the swings and laughed, actually laughed, back when laughter came easily to her. Past the veterinary clinic where she'd first gotten Max's vaccinations, when she'd been so happy and so certain that having him would fix everything. She'd been naive enough to think that love could solve family problems. It turned out that love couldn't do much of anything against the weight of adult dysfunction. The courthouse building rose up before them like something from a nightmare, all marble and concrete and imposing architecture designed to make people feel small. Emma's heart began to pound as her grandmother pulled into the parking garage. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. Somewhere in that building, a judge was waiting. Her mother would be there, probably with one of those lawyers who talked too fast and wore too much perfume. Her father would be there too, though Emma didn't know if he'd be sober or not. That had become the variable in her mental calculations about encounters with him. As they climbed the marble steps leading to the main entrance, Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph of Max, the one she'd printed on a small card and hidden there this morning without telling her grandmother. She touched it like a talisman, the way some people touched religious medals or lucky coins. Max was here with her, even if only in image form. Max was here, and as long as she had him, she could do this. The courthouse doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing an interior of high ceilings and echoing footsteps. People in business clothes moved purposefully from place to place, each one carrying files and expressions of professional detachment. Security guards stood at stations. Signs pointed toward various courtrooms and offices. It was all so cold, so clinical, so utterly devoid of compassion or understanding for what this day meant to a terrified 8-year-old girl. Emma's grandmother squeezed her hand. "Remember," she whispered, "you're going to be brave today, not because you have to be, but because you're stronger than you know." Emma wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that bravery was possible, that somehow she could walk into that courtroom and make this okay. But as she looked around at the marble and the lawyers and the overwhelming weight of adult systems designed to make decisions about her future, all she could think about was Max. Max at home, waiting for her. Max, who understood her without words. Max, who had shown her that loyalty and presence and unconditional love were real things that existed in this complicated, painful world. Today, someone would decide which parent got to keep her. But as Emma walked deeper into the courthouse, holding tight to her grandmother's hand and the secret image of Max in her pocket, she didn't yet know that the real power of this day would come from a bond that transcended the legal system entirely. She didn't know that before this day ended, everything would change, not because a judge would make a decision, but because a girl and her dog would finally find the courage to tell the truth. 3 years earlier, on a Saturday morning that started like any other, Emma's life had been gloriously, blissfully normal. She was 5 years old then, still young enough to believe that the world was fundamentally safe and that adults were trustworthy creatures who always meant well. Her parents still held hands in the car. Her father still laughed at her mother's jokes. Her mother still wore perfume and did her hair on weekends. The Martinez household existed in that golden age of stability that children are often too young to recognize as temporary, too innocent to understand wouldn't last forever. That particular Saturday, Emma's mother had surprised her with a trip to the animal shelter. "We're just going to look," had said, though Emma detected the telltale gleam in her mother's eye that suggested this was more than a casual outing. Her father, Michael, sat in the back seat beside Emma, his hand warm and solid in hers. The drive to the shelter had been filled with speculation. Emma had imagined possibilities, perhaps a kitten, a rabbit. She'd mentioned once, almost in passing, that she thought it would be nice to have a pet. She hadn't expected anyone to actually listen. The shelter smelled like industrial cleaner and something else underneath, something sad and hopeful and desperate all at once. The sounds were overwhelming: barking, meowing, the shuffle of anxious animals in their cages. Emma's father had held her hand as they walked through the corridors, past dogs of all sizes and temperaments. Some barked at their approach. Some pressed their faces against the cages, tails wagging with desperate hope. Some huddled in the back corners of their enclosures, too traumatized to engage with potential families. Then they'd turned a corner and seen him. A golden retriever, maybe 3 years old, with matted fur and sad, knowing eyes that seemed to contain entire stories of abandonment and loneliness. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't bark or jump or perform. He simply sat, watching them with an expression of such profound resignation that Emma's heart had literally hurt. According to the shelter worker, he'd been found wandering the streets, severely neglected, and no one had claimed him in the months he'd been at the facility. His name was Max, though the shelter worker said it was just a placeholder name. The previous owners hadn't bothered to leave documentation. Emma had turned to her parents and said, without any trace of doubt in her voice, "This one. I want this one." Her father had looked at her mother had looked at the dog, and then something had happened that Emma would replay in her mind countless times in the years to come. Her mother and father had exchanged a glance, a moment of perfect understanding, and smiled at each other, not as people arguing about something, but as a team, as partners, as people who genuinely loved each other and wanted to give their daughter something special. They'd filled out adoption papers that same day. Her father had made jokes about being a dog family now. Her mother had laughed, truly laughed, and suggested they stop for ice cream on the way home. In the car, Emma sat in the back seat with Max's head resting on her lap, his fur still matted but his eyes already beginning to lose some of that desperate quality they'd held at the shelter. Emma had whispered to him, making promises a 5-year-old makes to a dog she's just met. "I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to make sure you're never sad again. I'm going to love you so much that you'll forget everything bad that happened to you before." Those first months with Max had been transformative. Her father had worked from home part-time, and her mother had taken a week off from her nursing job to help the family adjust to their new member. They'd gone to dog training classes together, the 4 of them, laughing when Max did something ridiculous or unexpected. Emma's childhood had felt complete in a way she couldn't have articulated but absolutely felt. She had parents who loved each other, and a dog who looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. But gradually, imperceptibly, things had begun to shift. It started small tension at dinner, conversations that stopped abruptly when Emma entered a room, a particular tightness around her mother's mouth that hadn't been there before. Emma didn't have the vocabulary to understand that her father had started a business venture that was consuming his attention and draining their finances. She didn't know that her mother had been passed over for a promotion at work despite being overqualified, and the rejection had triggered something deeper, a sense that her sacrifices had been for nothing. She didn't know that marriage, even good ones, sometimes developed hairline fractures that, given enough pressure and time, could become canyons. What Emma did know was that Max sensed it before she fully did. The dog had begun to sleep at the foot of her bed on nights when she could hear her parents' voices rising in the kitchen. He'd started following her from room to room, as if afraid she might disappear. When her father's hands became rough during arguments, not violent, not yet, but tightly controlled and trembling with suppressed emotion, Max would position himself between them. It was as if the dog had appointed himself her bodyguard, her protector, her early warning system. By the time Emma turned 6, the house had transformed into a place where silence felt louder than shouting. Her parents barely looked at each other. Her mother had stopped wearing perfume. Her father came home later and later from work, often smelling of whiskey. Emma had learned to retreat into her room with Max, who never questioned why she needed to be held, why she cried silently into his fur, why some nights she fell asleep whispering her fears into his ear as if he were a confessor. The divorce proceedings had been initiated when Emma was 7. She remembered her mother sitting her down at the kitchen table, her voice carefully controlled, explaining that sometimes people grow apart and that it didn't mean her parents didn't love her. Emma had listened and nodded and said okay, but inside, she'd been fragmenting. She'd clung to Max that night with a desperation that probably would have alarmed her parents if they'd been paying attention, but they weren't. They were too busy with lawyers and dividing assets and figuring out custody arrangements to notice that their daughter was drowning. And that's when Emma had discovered the language. Through careful observation and experimentation, she'd begun to develop a system of hand signals and gestures that communicated with Max on a frequency that no human seemed to notice. A particular circular motion with 2 fingers meant, "I need courage." A downward pointing gesture meant, "Something bad is happening." A specific way of scratching behind his ears meant, "Help me be brave right now." Max learned these signals the way he seemed to learn everything about Emma, effortlessly, as if they'd been designed specifically for him to understand. By the time Emma turned 8, Max had become more than a pet. He was her co-conspirator, her emotional translator, her mirror. When she was angry, he was angry, his ears back, his movements sharp. When she was sad, he was sad, pressing against her legs, refusing to leave her side. When she was terrified, he transformed into something almost supernatural in his protectiveness, his instincts somehow attuned to the frequencies of her fear in ways that seemed almost psychic. She taught him tricks that went beyond normal dog obedience. She taught him to respond to her specific signals with specific behaviors. When she made the courage gesture, he'd place his paw on her knee. When she needed comfort, she'd make a certain movement and he'd climb onto the couch beside her, his body a warm, steady presence against her small frame. To anyone watching, these seemed like simply a girl and her dog bonding naturally. But to Emma, these were survival mechanisms. These were the tools she'd developed to stay afloat in a drowning situation. 3 years after the day she'd seen him at the shelter, as Emma sat in her grandmother's house waiting to go to a courthouse that would decide her fate, Max wasn't there physically. But he was everywhere, in her muscle memory, in the way her hands knew exactly how to signal her needs, in the language they'd created together. He was the proof that love could be unconditional, that presence mattered more than words, that sometimes the most powerful communication happened in silence, in gesture, in the deep understanding that passed between 2 broken beings who'd found each other in the dark. What nobody knew, not her teachers, not her grandmother, not the school counselor who asked cheerful questions about her home life during their monthly check-ins, was that Emma's house had become something terrifying. A place where the rules changed without warning, where safety was conditional, where a child had to constantly read the emotional weather of the adults around her and adjust herself accordingly. The custody arrangement during the separation was that Emma spent 3 days a week with her mother, 2 days with her father, and 2 with her grandmother. In theory, this divided attention was meant to give both parents equal time with their daughter while providing her with stable ground at her grandmother's house. In practice, it meant Emma lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, never knowing which version of her parents she would encounter. Her father's drinking had become the hidden architecture of their time together. It wasn't obvious at first. Michael Martinez was still functional, still capable of driving her to school and making dinner. But Emma, with the hypervigilance that abused children develop, could read the signs with devastating accuracy. The way his eyes looked slightly unfocused on certain afternoons, the careful precision with which he moved, as if directing each limb independently. The smell that clung to him, masked by mints and cologne but unmistakable to her sensitive nose. Whiskey, vodka, beer. The specific brand seemed to vary, but the effect was always the same, a loosening of his already fragile self-control. The drinking had intensified the volatility that had always simmered beneath the surface of Michael's personality. He'd been a volatile man even before the divorce, prone to sudden mood swings and overreactions to minor infractions. But sober, there was usually a moment where his anger burned hot and then faded. Drunk, the anger transformed into something else entirely, something that lingered, something that sought outlets. Emma had learned the hard way the specific behaviors that triggered her father's rage: asking too many questions, talking too loudly, forgetting small tasks, existing in ways that somehow violated his unpredictable standards. One evening she'd forgot to take out the trash. A minor oversight, the kind of thing any 8-year-old might do. But her father had come home after drinking at a bar with colleagues, found the overflowing trash can, and his response had been immediate and terrifying. He'd grabbed her arm, not gently, not with the caregiving touch of a parent, but with force. His fingers had dug into the soft inner skin of her arm with enough pressure to leave marks, deep, unmistakable bruises that bloomed purple and yellow over the following days. Emma had stared at those bruises in the mirror and understood, with a clarity that no child should have to possess, that she had to hide them. She'd pulled on long sleeves despite the summer heat. She'd avoided the school's swimming unit, claiming she had a stomachache. She'd been careful, so careful, to position her arms in photographs so the marks wouldn't be visible. She'd learned to carry her terror quietly, to smile when adults asked if she was okay, to perform normalcy with the skill of a trained actress. The worst part wasn't even the bruises, though they hurt both physically and in ways she couldn't articulate. The worst part was the aftermath. After the anger would come remorse. Her father would become almost frantic in his attempts to make amends, bringing her gifts, being excessively gentle, promising it would never happen again. He'd mean it when he said it. Emma could see the genuine anguish in his face. But then days would pass and he'd drink again, and the cycle would repeat. Rage, bruises, remorse, promises, temporary peace, rage again. It was a terrible pendulum that defined her weeks with him. Emma never told him that she knew about the drinking. She never said, "Dad, I can smell it on you," or "Dad, I'm scared when you look at me that way." Instead, she developed an elaborate system of prevention. She cleaned the house obsessively on days she was with him, trying to eliminate potential triggers. She made herself smaller, quieter, less present. She learned to anticipate his moods the way a sailor learns to read clouds before a storm. She performed the role of the perfect daughter so meticulously that sometimes she wondered if she was real underneath all the performance. Her mother's form of failure was almost the inverse, which somehow made it even more devastating in its own way. Martinez had fallen into depression, a clinical, serious depression that was less about sadness and more about the complete absence of the capacity to feel or function. After the divorce was finalized, she'd moved into a small apartment, and Emma quickly learned that these weeks with her mother were essentially weeks of her mother in bed. Would wake up occasionally to make sure Emma had eaten something, to perform the bare minimum functions of parenting. But then she'd retreat, sometimes for entire afternoons, into her darkened bedroom. She'd cry, though she tried to hide it from Emma. She'd sleep for hours in the middle of the day. She'd lose track of time. The apartment began to smell stale. Dishes piled up. Laundry accumulated in corners. Emma, at 8 years old, had become her mother's caregiver rather than the other way around. Emma learned to make simple meals: cereal, sandwiches, pasta with butter and salt. She learned to do her own laundry, figuring out the washing machine through trial and error, and asking the neighbor for help when something went wrong. She learned to get herself ready for school, to pack her own backpack, to do her own homework without anyone checking it. She learned that sometimes love and abandonment looked very similar. Both left you alone with your fears. Both made you feel unseen. Both required you to figure out how to survive without the actual support a child needed. The part of her mother's depression was that Emma could see, underneath it, the woman who had once been her mother. On rare mornings when emerged from her bedroom seeming almost like herself, Emma's heart would leap with hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe her mother would stay present. Maybe they could do something together. But these moments were islands of false hope in a sea of neglect. By afternoon, would sink again, pulled back under by whatever chemical imbalance or emotional weight was dragging her down. Emma never told anyone, not her teacher, not her grandmother, not her father, how bad it had become with her mother. She protected secret the way she protected the bruises on her arm. She smiled at school. She said fine when asked how things were going. She lied with the fluency of a child who'd learned that telling the truth only made things worse. Between her father's unpredictable violence and her mother's chronic emotional absence, Emma existed in a state of constant hypervigilance. At her grandmother's house, she was stiff and careful, always bracing for something to go wrong. She couldn't fully relax even there, couldn't trust that safety was real. The only place she found genuine peace was with Max. When she was with her dog, she didn't have to perform. She didn't have to hide bruises or manage her mother's emotions or anticipate her father's moods. She could just be a scared 8-year-old girl, and Max would be there, steady and loyal and unconditional. Max never looked at her with disappointment. He never left her alone with her fears. He never drank or cried or became emotionally unavailable. He simply existed beside her, his presence a constant reminder that some beings in this world could be counted on, that some love could be pure and uncomplicated, that it was possible to be broken and still be worthy of protection and devotion. Emma's home had become a minefield of pain and dysfunction, but in Max, she'd found an anchor, a reason to survive the unsurvivable, a being who looked at her bruises and her fears and her carefully constructed performance of normalcy and saw through all of it to the terrified child underneath. And he stayed. No matter how dark things became, Max stayed. Judge had been hearing custody cases for 31 years, and in that time she developed an almost supernatural ability to detect lies. She could read the subtle twitches of facial muscles that revealed deception. She could hear the variations in vocal tone that indicated a witness was straying from truth. She could sense when someone was withholding information, the way an experienced musician can hear when a single instrument is playing slightly out of tune in an otherwise harmonious orchestra. Her colleagues called her the human lie detector, a nickname that had followed her through law school and into her judicial career. In 3 decades on the bench, she'd built a reputation for seeing through carefully constructed narratives and getting to the heart of matters that others missed. But 8-year-old Emma Martinez was proving to be a challenge even for considerable skills. The hearing had begun at 9:30 a.m. in Judge Chambers. It was a relatively informal setting, chosen to be less intimidating for the child involved. The judge sat behind her mahogany desk, flanked by both parents' lawyers. Emma sat in a small chair that had been positioned slightly to the side, her grandmother standing nearby for support. Michael Martinez wore an expensive suit that didn't quite hide the tremor in his hands. Martinez had dressed carefully, her hair done, makeup applied, a performance of stability. Both parents looked appropriately concerned, appropriately sad. Both performed their roles with the precision of people who'd rehearsed them many times. Judge began gently, as she always did with children. She established rapport, asked basic questions about school and hobbies, the kind of conversational opening that was meant to make Emma feel at ease. Emma answered in a small voice, her words carefully chosen. Yes, she liked school. Yes, she had friends. Yes, she enjoyed art and reading and playing outside. All acceptable answers, all completely unrevealing. Then the judge moved into more substantive territory. Emma, I want to talk to you about where you live. Can you tell me what it's like when you're at your father's house? Emma's eyes darted toward her father, then away. It's nice, she said. He makes me dinner. We watch movies sometimes. Judge made a note, then asked, and what about your mother's house? It's nice too, Emma said, with the identical intonation, the identical lack of inflection. We have a garden. There are books there. The pattern continued. Every question was met with answer that was technically accurate but emotionally hollow. Emma was performing the role of a child who'd learned that honesty created consequences. Judge recognized this immediately. She'd seen dozens of children who'd been coached by their parents, who'd learned through trial and error which truths were safe to tell and which would cause problems. But something about Emma's performance felt different. This wasn't a child who'd been directly coached. This was a child who'd internalized the lesson that her own reality was less important than maintaining the fragile peace of her fractured family. "Emma," Judge said, setting down her pen, "I need you to know something. In this room there are no wrong answers. This isn't like school where there are right and wrong responses. I'm trying to understand what's best for you. I need you to be honest with me." Emma looked at the judge with an expression that broke something in the experienced woman's chest. It was the look of a child who didn't believe that honesty could possibly lead anywhere good. It was the look of someone who'd learned that the truth was dangerous. "I'm fine," Emma said quietly. "I'm fine at both houses." Judge exchanged a look with Emma's grandmother, who looked deeply worried. She could sense that something was being concealed, but without Emma's cooperation, she couldn't force the truth into the open. She was about to move forward when one of the lawyers, a woman named Sarah who represented Emma's best interests as an independent advocate rather than either parent's interests, spoke up. "Your Honor, I'd like to request an adjournment. I believe there may be additional factors that should be considered in this case." Judge raised an eyebrow. "What sort of factors?" Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "During our preliminary interviews, Emma mentioned something about an emotional support animal. I believe it might be beneficial for her to have this animal present during her testimony. It might help her feel more comfortable speaking honestly." Judge's first instinct was to refuse. Courtrooms weren't petting zoos. Animals had no place in official proceedings. It was unprofessional, irregular, and set a precedent she wasn't comfortable with. She was about to say as much when she looked at Emma again and saw the child's entire body tense at the mention of the animal. Emma's hands, which had been clenched in her lap, suddenly unclenched slightly. It was a minute change, barely perceptible, but Judge saw it. "What animal?" Judge asked Emma directly. "My dog," Emma whispered. "Max, he helps me." Something in that simple statement, that vulnerability, that admission, changed the room's entire energy. Looked away. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah watched the judge's face carefully, hoping the experienced woman would see what she saw. Judge was silent for a long moment, considering. She'd never allowed an animal in her courtroom before. She'd always maintained strict boundaries about what belonged in these formal proceedings. But she'd also been doing this work long enough to know that sometimes the most powerful justice came not from following rules, but from recognizing when the rules themselves were obstacles to truth. She was about to make a decision that would have ripple effects far beyond this single case, though she didn't fully realize it yet. "We'll adjourn for 2 hours," Judge finally said. "Ms., make arrangements to have this dog brought to the courthouse. We'll reconvene at noon. And I want it on record that I'm allowing this departure from standard procedure because I believe it may be necessary to facilitate the child's honest testimony." There was a stirring in the room. Michael's lawyer began to object. Judge silenced him with a look. "We're adjourned." The 2-hour break felt both impossibly long and over in a flash. Emma's grandmother used the time to take her to a small coffee shop in the courthouse basement, where she bought her a hot chocolate and sat with her hand on Emma's small shoulder. Emma didn't speak much. She just stared into her drink, as if the marshmallows floating on top contained answers to questions she was afraid to ask. At noon, when everyone reconvened, Max was brought in by a police officer who worked with the courthouse's K-9 unit. The dog was alert and calm, his movements purposeful. When he saw Emma, his entire body language changed. His tail began to wag, and he walked directly to her, pressing his large head against her legs with the care of a creature who understood exactly how fragile this small human was. Judge watched the transformation. Emma's whole body relaxed. Her shoulders, which had been hunched near her ears, dropped. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, slowed. She wrapped her arms around Max's neck and buried her face in his fur. "Okay," Judge said quietly, her tone completely different from before. "Now we're ready. Tell me the truth, Emma. What is it really like at home?" And as Max settled beside her, his warm presence a reassurance that she wasn't alone, Emma took the first breath of truth she'd taken in months. Judge watched with the intensity of someone who just realized she was witnessing something profound. Not just a custody case, but a moment where a child was finally finding the courage to speak the unspeakable. The moment Max's massive head rested against Emma's knee, something shifted in the fundamental architecture of the courtroom. The formal space, with its heavy wooden furniture and official seals and the weight of institutional authority, suddenly felt less like a place of judgment and more like a sanctuary. Emma's hand, which had been trembling moments before, stilled as she buried her fingers in Max's golden fur. She could feel his heartbeat through her palm, steady, present, real. Every muscle in her small body unclenched slightly, as if permission had finally been granted to let go of the exhausting performance of normalcy she'd been maintaining for so long. Judge leaned forward slightly, her expression transformed from stern authority into something more like gentle witnessing. "Emma," she said, her voice carefully modulated to be soft but not patronizing, "I need you to know something very important. Max is here with you now, you're safe, and I need you to tell me the truth about what your home is really like. Not the version you think I want to hear, not the version you've told teachers before. The real truth. Can you do that?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Max. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at her mother. She looked only at the dog, as if he were the only real thing in a room full of performance and pretense. "Sometimes," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I'm at Dad's house, he's different. He smells different, like something sweet that makes my nose hurt. And when he's like that, everything makes him mad." She paused, gathering courage from the solid presence of the dog beneath her hand. "One time I forgot to take out the trash, and he grabbed my arm really hard, and his fingers, they left marks." There was a sharp intake of breath from Martinez. Michael's face went pale, then red. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgently in his ear, but Michael seemed barely to hear it. Judge made careful notes, her experienced hand steady despite the gravity of what she was hearing. "Emma, I need you to show me. Where did he grab your arm?" This was the moment. This was the threshold between silence and truth-telling, between the protected secret and the revealed reality. Emma's hand hesitated for only a moment before she gently pulled up the long sleeve of her dress. The dress her grandmother had carefully chosen this morning, one with long sleeves that covered the summer heat and the evidence of her father's rage. The marks were still visible, not as dark as they had been 2 weeks ago, but unmistakable, finger-shaped bruises on the inside of her arm, evidence of force and control. Judge's face went very still. She set down her pen with deliberate care, as if the weight of what she was seeing required her full attention. "Those marks," Judge said quietly, "those happen at your father's house." Emma nodded, still not meeting anyone's eyes except Max's. The dog, sensing the significance of the moment, pressed his body more firmly against her leg, as if physically anchoring her to this moment of truth-telling. "And has this happened more than once?" the judge asked. Emma's voice became even smaller. "Many times, but this is the biggest mark. Usually they go away faster." The lawyer representing Michael immediately began to object, but Judge held up her hand without looking away from Emma. "I want to hear everything, Emma. Tell me about the other times. Tell me about what it feels like." And then, with Max as her anchor and her witness, Emma began to speak. She talked about the unpredictability of her father's moods. She described the smell of alcohol on his breath, the way his eyes would glaze over at certain times of day. She explained how she'd learned to anticipate his anger, to make herself small and quiet, to try to prevent the explosions by being the perfect daughter. She talked about the moments afterward when he would be apologetic and frightened by his own actions, buying her gifts and making promises that he'd never do it again. She described the cycle, the false peace, the building tension, the explosion, the remorse, and then the whole terrible dance beginning again. The courtroom was utterly silent except for Emma's small voice. Her grandmother had her hand over her mouth, was crying, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Michael sat rigidly, his face a mask of denial and horror at his own behavior being laid bare. Then Emma's testimony took another turn. Without being directly asked, she began to talk about her mother, about the days spent in the small apartment with someone who couldn't get out of bed, about making her own meals because there was no one to feed her, about doing her own laundry because clean clothes didn't wash themselves, about the loneliness of having a parent who loved you but couldn't show up for you, who was so trapped in her own pain that she couldn't see her daughter's pain. "Mom is sad all the time," Emma said, her voice carrying a different quality now, not fear but grief. "She tries, but she can't, and I don't know how to help her. I try to be quiet and not make things worse." Made a sound, something between a sob and a moan, and her lawyer had to put a restraining hand on her arm to keep her in her seat. Throughout all of this testimony, Emma continued to hold on to Max. The dog never moved, never broke the contact. He was perfectly still, a living anchor in a storm of revelation. Judge asked clarifying questions, gentle but precise. When did the bruises happen? What had triggered the anger? Had there been other forms of discipline? How often did Emma see her mother unable to care for herself? Had anyone at school noticed anything unusual? Emma answered each question with increasing clarity, as if the act of speaking truth had loosened something frozen inside her, had opened a valve that released all the dammed-up secrets she'd been carrying alone. Then Judge asked the question that seemed to be the most important of all. "Emma, if you could choose, where would you want to live? What would make you feel safe?" Emma was silent for a long moment. Then she made a small gesture with her hand, a circular motion with her index and middle finger that Max immediately recognized. It was the signal for courage, the signal she'd created with her dog to communicate the most important message of all: "I need to be brave right now." Max placed his paw gently on her knee, exactly as he'd been trained to do countless times during their private sessions at her grandmother's house. "I want to live where I can be with Max," Emma said finally, "and where I don't have to be afraid, and where Mom and Dad, where they get help to be better parents, because I don't think they're bad people. I just think they're broken, and they need to fix themselves before they can take care of me." It was a level of insight and emotional maturity that seemed impossible from an 8-year-old, and yet it rang with the absolute clarity of truth. This was a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd been traumatized, and yet who still held within her heart the capacity for compassion and understanding. Judge set down her pen and looked directly at Emma. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel in her professional capacity. "Thank you for being so brave, Emma. Thank you for telling me the truth. You did the right thing. You did exactly the right thing." Emma finally looked up at the judge, and for the first time in the entire hearing, her face relaxed into something that might have been relief. She'd done it. She'd told. And the world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. Instead, something felt like it had shifted toward justice, toward healing, toward the possibility that adults might finally step in and protect her the way Max had been protecting her all along. The recess that Judge called lasted only 15 minutes, but in that time, everything shifted. Emma was taken to a private room with her grandmother and a court-appointed child advocate, while the judge met privately with both parents and their legal representatives. What happened in that judge's chamber would later be described by those present as the moment when denial finally crumbled. Michael Martinez sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might crack. His lawyer had advised him to remain silent, to deny everything, to suggest that his 8-year-old daughter was confused or had been coached by her mother. But Michael couldn't do it. He couldn't maintain the facade anymore. As Judge reviewed the medical evidence that had been ordered during the recess, documentation of bruises consistent with forced gripping, the timeline of injuries, the pattern of concealment. Something inside him broke. "I did it," he said suddenly, his voice hollow and destroyed. His lawyer immediately put a hand on his arm, but Michael shook him off. "I did all of it. I didn't mean to hurt her. I never meant to hurt her. But the drinking, God, the drinking made me into someone I don't recognize, someone cruel, someone capable of bruising his own daughter's arm." His hands were shaking so badly he had to clasp them together to control them. "I've been telling myself it wasn't that bad, that I was just being firm, that discipline required, that I was teaching her discipline, but watching her sit there, showing those bruises, explaining how she'd hidden them, I finally saw myself, and I'm disgusted by what I saw." Judge let him speak, recognizing the importance of this moment. She'd seen many parents deny responsibility, construct elaborate justifications for their behavior, blame their children or their circumstances or anything except themselves. But she'd also seen rare moments like this, where a person finally crossed the threshold from denial into accountability. It was uncomfortable to witness, but it was also the first step toward genuine change. "I need help," Michael continued, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I'm capable of being a good father, but I know I need help. I need to stop drinking. I need to understand why I became this person. And I need Emma to know that this was never about her. She was never the problem. I was the problem." This breakdown was different in character but no less profound. She sat in the waiting area, having requested to speak to the judge separately from her ex-husband, and the weight of her failure seemed to physically crush her. She'd known, on some level, that Emma was suffering. A mother always knows, but she'd been so lost in her own depression, so consumed by her own pain, that she'd allowed herself to look away. "I was supposed to protect her," said, her words interrupted by harsh sobs. "I was her mother, and instead of protecting her, I abandoned her to take care of me. Do you know what that means? My daughter, my baby, was doing laundry and making meals while I lay in bed crying. She was parenting herself. She was parenting me." The court-appointed social worker who was present made careful notes, recognizing that this too was a crucial moment. Continued speaking, the words tumbling out like a dam breaking. "I took her to the doctor once and I didn't even notice the bruises on her arm. I was so wrapped up in my own depression that I didn't see my daughter being physically abused by her father. What kind of mother misses that? What kind of mother fails so completely?" "A mother who needs help," the social worker said gently. "But you're asking the right questions now. That's the first step." Looked up, her face ravaged by tears and guilt. "What do I do? How do I fix this? How do I become the mother she deserves?" Judge, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "You get treatment. You acknowledge that you have a serious mental health condition that interfered with your capacity to parent. You do the work, real, difficult, sustained work, to treat that condition. And you accept that for now, Emma cannot live with you. Not because you're a bad person, but because you're not currently capable of providing the safety and stability she needs. That's not punishment. That's honesty." When Emma was called back into the judge's chambers an hour later, the energy had transformed entirely. Both parents looked diminished, as if speaking truth had somehow made them smaller. Emma walked in with Max and her grandmother, her small hand still gripping the dog's collar. Judge addressed Emma directly, ignoring the lawyers and the formal protocols. "I want you to know what happened after you left this room. Your father admitted that he hurt you. He said he's been drinking, and that the drinking made him into someone he doesn't want to be. He said he's going to get help. Your mother also admitted that she hasn't been able to take care of you the way she should because of her depression. She also said she's going to get help." Emma's eyes grew wide. She looked at her father, then at her mother, searching their faces as if trying to confirm that the judge was telling the truth. But Judge continued, "That doesn't mean everything goes back to normal. Both of them need to get real help, therapy, treatment, support, before they can take care of you again. And while they're doing that, you're going to live with your grandmother. You'll still see both of your parents, but in supervised settings, at least at first. and you'll keep seeing the school counselor and a therapist who specializes in helping children." Emma nodded slowly, processing this information. It wasn't perfect. She still wanted her family to be whole and functional. But for the first time, she understood that brokenness didn't have to be permanent, that adults could acknowledge their failures and commit to change. "And Max," Judge said, her eyes warm as she looked at the dog, "Max is going to be very important to your healing. I'm going to recommend that you be part of a special program where you can bring him to school on days when you're feeling particularly anxious or scared. Max has helped you find your voice. He's going to help you heal from what happened." Michael Martinez requested to speak to Emma, and Judge allowed it, with the social worker present. He approached his daughter slowly, as if she were something fragile and precious that he'd nearly destroyed. He knelt down to be at eye level with her. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I'm so sorry for hurting you. You didn't deserve that, you never deserved that, and I want you to know that I'm going to get help, real help. I'm going to stop drinking and I'm going to learn how to be the father you deserve. It's going to take time, but I'm going to do it. I promise you." Emma didn't respond. She was 8 years old and had learned not to trust promises. But she watched his face, and she saw something in it that she'd rarely seen before, genuine remorse mixed with genuine commitment to change. Also approached her daughter hesitantly as if afraid that Emma might flinch away from her. "I love you so much," whispered, kneeling beside her. "I know I haven't shown it very well. I know I've been absent when you needed me, but I love you and I'm going to get better. I'm going to be the mother you deserve. You just have to give me time." Emma looked at her mother and felt a complicated mix of emotions: anger at her absence, sadness about her suffering, a fragile hope that maybe, eventually, could heal. Max, sensing the emotional intensity of the moment, moved closer to Emma, positioning himself as a barrier between her and the adults, a physical reminder that she had someone who would always protect her. Judge watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. She'd made the right call allowing the dog into her courtroom. This dog wasn't just a pet. This dog was a healer, a truth-teller, an anchor to reality in a world that had become dangerously unstable. As the hearing concluded, Judge made one final statement, speaking as much to the court record as to the people in the room. "This case demonstrates the critical importance of listening to children, of providing them with the tools and support they need to speak truth, and of recognizing that sometimes unconventional approaches, like allowing an emotional support animal into these proceedings, can be the difference between continued suffering and the possibility of healing. I will be recommending to the court system that we expand our protocols around emotional support animals in custody cases involving children." Emma left the courthouse that afternoon with her grandmother and Max, not yet fully understanding that her courage had changed not just her own life, but potentially the way the entire system would approach similar cases in the future. The machinery of the legal system, once set in motion by Emma's testimony, moved with surprising efficiency. By that evening, Child Protective Services had been and had opened a formal investigation into both households. A medical examination was scheduled for the following morning to document the bruises on Emma's arm and to rule out any other injuries that might have been sustained and hidden. Social workers began conducting home visits, examining both Michael's apartment and to assess their living conditions and capacity to provide safe environments for a child. The investigation into Michael Martinez was swift and comprehensive. His apartment was found to be relatively clean, but showed evidence of heavy drinking: empty bottles in the recycling bin, whiskey stains on the kitchen counter, a general air of neglect that suggested self-care had taken a backseat to alcohol consumption. More significantly, when officers questioned his employers and colleagues, a pattern emerged. Multiple people reported witnessing Michael's mood swings, his unpredictability, his occasional aggressive outbursts at work. One colleague mentioned an incident 6 months ago when Michael had thrown a stapler across the room during a meeting, an action he'd later apologized for with excessive remorse. The social worker assigned to Michael's case, a woman named who'd been in the profession for 12 years, recognized the classic patterns of alcoholism combined with what appeared to be undiagnosed or untreated depression and anger management issues. She sat across from Michael in his apartment, her notepad filled with observations and questions. "I need to be honest with you," said, her tone professional but not unkind. "What happened with your daughter is serious, very serious. Physical abuse of a minor is a criminal matter. The fact that you admitted to it in court means there will likely be criminal charges. You're looking at mandatory counseling, anger management classes, substance abuse treatment, and possibly jail time, depending on how the prosecutor decides to proceed." Michael sat with his head in his hands, the weight of consequences finally settling on him. "I deserve whatever happens," he said quietly, "but I need to know what I can do to get better, what I can do to try to be in Emma's life again." Outline the requirements: court-ordered rehabilitation for his alcoholism, mandatory therapy to address the trauma that seemed to underlie his anger issues, parenting classes, regular drug testing to verify sobriety, and supervised visitation with Emma until the court determined he was safe. It was a rigorous program, but it was also a pathway forward. Not easy, not quick, but possible. "The good news," said, "is that you're showing genuine remorse and willingness to engage with treatment. That matters. It doesn't erase what you did, but it means you're not in denial about your problem. That's the first step toward real change." Michael nodded, and that very week, he admitted himself to a residential rehabilitation facility. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, leaving his job temporarily, acknowledging to the world that he had a serious substance abuse problem, accepting that he couldn't control his drinking through willpower alone. The facility was stark and institutional, filled with other people who'd also hit their own rock bottoms. He underwent medical detoxification, attended group therapy sessions, began individual counseling, and for the first time in years, existed in an environment where alcohol was completely unavailable. His path was different but equally demanding. The investigation into her household revealed a woman in the depths of clinical depression, so disconnected from her responsibilities that her apartment had become unsanitary. There were dishes piled in the sink, laundry covering the bedroom floor, a general atmosphere of abandonment and neglect. However, unlike Michael's case, situation was viewed as a mental health crisis rather than primarily as intentional abuse. A psychiatrist was brought in to evaluate, and she was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, complicated by trauma from the divorce and possibly underlying anxiety issues. Within days, she was prescribed medication, an SSRI that would take several weeks to reach therapeutic levels, but that represented the beginning of chemical rebalancing for her brain. She began intensive outpatient therapy 3 times a week, working with a therapist who specialized in trauma and depression. The social worker assigned to his case, a man named Dr. James, worked with her on developing a comprehensive treatment plan. Unlike Michael's situation, wasn't facing criminal charges because her failure to care for Emma, while serious, stemmed from mental illness rather than intentional abuse or violence. However, she was still required to comply with all court-ordered treatment and couldn't have unsupervised custody of Emma until she demonstrated sustained improvement. "I feel like I'm failing her all over again," said during one of her therapy sessions, tears streaming down her face as she discussed the custody arrangement. "You're not failing her now," her therapist, Dr. Sarah Williams, said gently. "What you're doing now is putting her safety first. You're acknowledging that you're not currently capable of being her primary caregiver and you're getting help. That's not failure. That's responsibility." Gradually began to stabilize. Within 2 weeks of starting medication, she felt the fog beginning to lift, not dramatically, not overnight, but incrementally. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest every morning began to lighten. She was able to get out of bed without it feeling like she was swimming through concrete. She took a shower without it being a monumental undertaking. Small victories that meant everything. She also attended a parenting class specifically designed for parents dealing with mental illness, where she learned strategies for managing her depression while still being present for her daughter. She joined a support group for people with depression and discovered that she wasn't alone in her struggle, that other people had walked this path and had found their way back to functional, meaningful lives. Emma, meanwhile, was living with her grandmother, and in some ways this arrangement was the most beneficial thing that could have happened. Her grandmother's home was stable, predictable, and safe. There was consistent food, consistent sleep schedules, and most importantly, consistent emotional attunement. Emma's grandmother noticed when Emma was anxious and responded with comfort rather than demands. She noticed when Emma was processing trauma and gave her space to do so. She created rituals, bedtime stories, Saturday morning pancakes, weekly dog park visits with Max that provided structure and normalcy. Emma began seeing a child psychologist, Dr. Miranda Foster, who specialized in trauma in children. Dr. Foster recognized that Emma had developed significant hypervigilance, anxiety, and what appeared to be mild PTSD symptoms from her experiences. She worked with Emma using evidence-based approaches including cognitive behavioral therapy adapted for children and trauma-focused interventions. Importantly, she also recognized the critical role that Max played in Emma's healing. Max is actually functioning as a therapeutic tool, Dr. Foster explained to Emma's grandmother. Emma has created signals with him that allow her to communicate her emotional needs without having to use words. This is incredibly sophisticated coping for an 8-year-old. Rather than trying to change it, we should be supporting it and helping Emma understand why it works so well for her. She worked with Emma and Max together, helping Emma understand the psychology behind her signals, teaching her that it was okay to ask for help, that asking for comfort wasn't weakness. She helped Emma process the trauma of the abuse, the betrayal of having a father who hurt her, the complicated grief of having a mother who loved her but couldn't show up for her. 6 months into the process, the exact timeline Judge had established for reassessment, the transformation was remarkable. Michael had completed his residential rehabilitation program and was living in a sober living facility while continuing his outpatient therapy and attending AA meetings regularly. He'd been sober for 6 months, a significant milestone. He'd completed anger management training and attended parenting classes. The criminal charges had resulted in probation rather than jail time, conditional on his continued compliance with treatment. Had stabilized significantly on her medication. She'd returned to part-time work as a counselor, finding that helping others actually helped her. Her apartment was clean and organized. She was attending therapy regularly and had built a support network. She still struggled with depression. It wasn't something that would ever completely disappear, but it was managed, controlled, and no longer debilitating. Both parents requested supervised visitation with Emma, and Judge granted it. The first visits were awkward and emotionally charged. Emma was tentative, unsure if she could trust the changes her parents claimed to have made. But gradually, over weeks of consistent, positive interactions, something shifted. Emma began to believe that the changes might be real. She began to allow herself to hope that maybe, eventually, her family might be functional again. Judge met with all parties 3 months into the 6-month reassessment period, and the progress was undeniable. Michael had maintained his sobriety, had established a stable living situation, and had demonstrated genuine behavioral change. Had sustained her treatment and was functioning at a level that suggested she could begin to assume more parenting responsibilities. Emma, while still processing her trauma, was visibly healing. She was sleeping better, her anxiety was decreasing, and she spoke about both parents with a more balanced perspective, acknowledging their failures while also acknowledging their capacity for change. "I want to commend all of you," Judge said, addressing the room. "What you've done, acknowledging failure, committing to genuine change, and doing the hard work of becoming better, is remarkable. It's also rare. Many people never reach this point, but I want to be clear, this progress doesn't erase what happened. Emma was harmed. She will carry that experience with her for the rest of her life. But what she's also learning is that people can change, that accountability matters, and that healing is possible even after trauma. She turned to address both Michael and, "The court is granting both of you unsupervised visitation with Emma, contingent on your continued compliance with all treatment requirements. However, custody will remain with her grandmother for 6 more months, after which we'll reassess. This isn't punishment. This is acknowledging that healing takes time, and Emma needs stability as she processes her trauma." As everyone left the courthouse that day, Emma walked between her parents and her grandmother, Max on a leash beside her. For the first time in a very long time, the future seemed less like an impossible minefield and more like a genuine possibility. 1 year after the initial custody hearing, Emma sat in Judge's office, not a formal courtroom, but a warm, welcoming space with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. The judge had requested this meeting to mark what she called a milestone moment in Emma's case, though Emma didn't fully understand why this particular day warranted special recognition. What she did understand was that Max was with her, lying peacefully on the floor at her feet, his head resting on his paws with the serene contentment of a dog who'd finally found his purpose. Judge smiled warmly at Emma over her reading glasses. "I wanted to see you today to tell you something important. A year ago, you walked into a courtroom terrified and silent, and then you found your voice. Do you remember that day?" Emma nodded slowly, the memory both painful and distant now. "I was scared." "You were," Judge agreed, "but you were also incredibly brave, and what you did, what you were willing to speak changed things, not just for you but for other children too." Judge explained that she'd been working with the court system to implement a new protocol specifically designed around Emma's case. The protocol allowed for emotional support animals in custody hearings involving children, recognizing that sometimes unconventional approaches broke through barriers that traditional methods couldn't penetrate. Already, 3 other cases had utilized the protocol, and in each case, children who'd been reluctant to speak had found their voices with their animals present. "You help create something that will help other children," Judge said. "That's extraordinary." Emma looked down at Max, who seemed to sense the significance of the moment and thumped his tail against the floor. She thought about all the other scared children who might walk into courtrooms in the coming years, and she felt something that wasn't quite pride but was close to it. A sense that her pain hadn't been for nothing, that her courage had created something that mattered. But the most significant changes were in Emma's daily life. Her custody arrangement had been finalized the previous month, and it was remarkably different from the custody battles that had seemed so catastrophic a year ago. Emma would live primarily with her grandmother, who had proven to be exactly what Emma needed: stable, nurturing, and deeply committed to her healing. However, she would spend weekends with her father and Wednesday evenings with her mother. Importantly, both parents had maintained their commitment to treatment. Michael had been sober for 14 months now, was taking her medication consistently, and continuing therapy. Michael had rebuilt his life with methodical determination. He'd found new employment with a company that took mental health and substance abuse seriously, offering employee assistance programs and flexible scheduling for people in recovery. He attended AA meetings 4 nights a week, not out of court requirement anymore, that had ended, but out of genuine commitment. He developed close friendships with other people in recovery who understood his struggle in ways that non-alcoholics simply couldn't. Most importantly, he developed a relationship with Emma that was fundamentally different from before. The man who'd once grabbed her arm in anger now spent their time together doing things deliberately chosen to be calm and low pressure. They'd go to the dog park and watch Max play with other dogs. They'd get ice cream and sit on benches talking about her school and her interests. They'd work on art projects together in his apartment, creating paintings and drawings that Emma displayed proudly in her grandmother's home. But perhaps most importantly, Michael had learned to apologize, not in the old way where apologies were followed by promises that shifted responsibility away from him, but in a new way where he simply acknowledged what he'd done and expressed genuine remorse without expectation of immediate forgiveness. "I hurt you," he'd said to Emma during one of their early visits, "and I'm sorry for that. I'm working every day to make sure I never hurt anyone like that again. But I know my apology doesn't undo what happened. It just means I'm taking responsibility for my actions." His journey had been one of slow but steady improvement. The medication had found its proper dosage, and she'd stopped the constant battle against a brain chemistry that had been working against her. She'd returned to work full-time and had even been promoted to a supervisory position because of her demonstrated skill in counseling traumatized individuals. Her own experience with depression gave her credibility and empathy that made her exceptionally good at her job. Most importantly, had learned to be present for Emma in age-appropriate ways. On Wednesday evenings, she and Emma would cook dinner together, simple meals like pasta or chicken, nothing elaborate, but time spent together doing something nurturing and normal. They'd talk about Emma's day, her worries, her dreams. Had also engaged in what her therapist called repair work, explicitly acknowledging to Emma the ways she'd failed her and expressing gratitude for Emma's patience as she healed. "I wasn't the mother you deserved," said to Emma one evening as they sat on her apartment's balcony watching the sunset. "I was sick, and I let my sickness get in the way of taking care of you, but I want you to know that it was never about you. It was never because you weren't worthy of my care. It was because my brain was broken, and I'm fixing it, and I'm so grateful that you're giving me the chance to be a better mother." Emma had hugged her mother that night, and they'd both cried, but these were different tears than before. These were tears of grief for what had been lost, but also tears of healing and the possibility of moving forward. School had become a place of remarkable transformation for Emma as well. Her teacher, Mrs. Richardson, had worked closely with Dr. Foster and Emma's grandmother to create accommodations that helped her manage her anxiety. Emma was allowed to take breaks when she felt overwhelmed. She was allowed to use a calm corner in the classroom where she could decompress. And most significantly, she'd been approved to bring Max to school 2 days a week as part of the expanded emotional support animal program that Judge had championed. On those days, Max would wear a special vest identifying him as an emotional support animal, and he would spend the day in Emma's classroom. He had an established routine. He'd nap on a mat in the corner during most of the day, but during times when Emma was feeling anxious or struggling, test days, times when conflicts arose with peers, moments when she was processing difficult emotions, Max would be by her side. His presence had a remarkable calming effect not just on Emma, but on her entire class. Students who were anxious about tests would ask to pet Max. Children who were upset would sit with him. The dog had somehow become a therapist for the entire school community. Other students had begun asking Emma about Max, about their special signals, about how her dog knew when she needed help. Emma, in her child's way, had become something of a teacher herself, explaining how Max could sense emotions and how having an animal who understood you unconditionally helped you feel less alone. She talked openly about her trauma, not in graphic detail, but in age-appropriate ways that helped other children understand that trauma wasn't something to be ashamed of, that healing was possible, and that sometimes the most unexpected sources of support could make all the difference. One afternoon, a girl named Sophia approached Emma at recess. "My mom's boyfriend is really mean sometimes," Sophia said quietly, "and I don't know what to do. You're brave. You told on your dad. How did you do that?" Emma had looked at Sophia with an understanding that transcended the fact that she was only 8 years old. "I told because I had Max, because he helped me be brave. You need to tell a grown-up you trust, a teacher or a counselor or your grandmother or someone, because what's happening to you isn't okay, and you deserve to be safe." The conversation that followed led to Sophia's mother finally connecting with resources to leave her abusive relationship. The ripples of Emma's courage continued to spread in ways she didn't fully comprehend. A year into recovery, as Emma sat in Judge's office with Max at her feet, she understood on some level that everything had changed. Her family wasn't perfect. Her parents weren't perfect. She still carried trauma from what had happened to her. There were still nightmares sometimes, still moments when she felt the old anxiety rising up. But she also carried something else. Proof that people could change, that systems could work toward justice and healing simultaneously, and that sometimes the most powerful voice belonged to a small girl and her faithful dog who refused to stay silent. Judge reached down and scratched Max behind the ears, and the dog's tail wagged appreciatively. "You know what I learned from your case, Emma?" the judge asked. "I learned that sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about creating the conditions where people can become better versions of themselves. Your father hurt you, and he's being held accountable for that. But he's also being given the opportunity to change, and he's taking it. Your mother failed you, and she's acknowledging that failure and working to repair it. And you survived something that would have broken many people. You found your voice, and in doing so, you gave other people permission to find theirs." As Emma left the judge's office that day, holding Max's leash and walking beside her grandmother, she looked back at Judge one more time. The judge was standing in her doorway, and she gave Emma a small wave, a gesture that carried within it acknowledgement, pride, and hope for all the children whose lives might be changed because one brave girl had finally found the courage to speak. Emma made the signal to Max, the one that meant we did it, we survived, we won. Max's tail wagged in response, and together they walked out into the afternoon light, toward a future that had once seemed impossible but now felt like it might actually be within reach.